Hello, my name is Mal Grassinger. I work at Gallaudet University as the Assistant Director of Development. And I am here to talk about what I have decided to do with sending my two deaf children to school. And it was very difficult for me and my wife to come to this decision about what to do with our children. So we looked at several different options, including sending them to a hearing school, a deaf school. We looked at two deaf schools in particular, one called Kindle and one called Frederick School for the Deaf. It was very difficult for us. We realized that now, it's our turn to consider the options, because we've seen lots of our other friends who have children who are also deaf, and they struggled with coming to a conclusion too. So before I dive into that, I want to explain that before I was the Director of Development at Gallaudet, I was a recruiter, and I traveled to all different schools around the United States, including public schools, deaf schools, and I'd seen a lot of variation between children who were attending hearing schools and children who were attending deaf schools. But before I delve into the experiences that I had, I want to explain that these are my opinions. These are not the opinions of the majority. These are not other parents' opinions. I realize that everybody has different views on this, but as far as what I've seen across the United States, these are just my opinions. So as I was giving lectures to deaf students across the United States, whether it be a hearing school or a deaf school, I came to a very interesting conclusion. I noticed that the groups of deaf children from mainstream schools were very quiet and just spent all of the time listening. Once my lecture was over, there wasn't any discussion that followed. However, deaf children from deaf schools were very eager to be involved in conversation. They were actively engaged and asked a lot of questions, and there was always conversation that followed the lecture. But deaf students from hearing schools, most of them were hardly signing, and I wondered, how do they communicate with their teachers? They can't go through an interpreter because the interpreter doesn't always understand their signs, so I wonder, many people who have hearing loss, they're not getting 100% of that information. Children who have hearing loss get 70 to 80% of the information on a daily basis, but when they're in an academic setting, that falls to even 60 to 55%. That's a lot of guesswork. That's a lot of lip reading involved for those students. So now at Gallaudet, I work with lots of students who enter their preparatory or freshman year, and we keep a lot of discussion throughout their years before graduation. And many of those students who come and see me from mainstream schools almost always say, wow, this is so different. I wish I would have experienced this when I was younger. They're getting the best communication possible in school in Gallaudet, and they realize, all these teachers sign. I'm getting all kinds of socialization with my peers around me who also sign. I'm learning inside the classroom, but more importantly, outside of the classroom as well. But that doesn't happen at mainstream schools. Mainstream hearing schools, they have the interpreter for the class session. And when a deaf student asks a question, because the interpreter is always delayed, that question is not following the conversation. It's always going to be delayed. And so it's embarrassing for the deaf person to ask the question because that's not where the conversation is for the hearing people. And then once class is finished, the interpreter leaves. They're done with their assignment. So if you want anything outside of class, you're not going to get that as a deaf person in a hearing school. They might have the occasional hearing person who would try to sign, gesture, maybe fingers go a little bit, but it is not the same as socializing with a group of deaf children. So can you imagine growing up like that your whole life? And it's even worse when you have hearing parents at home. It's the same at home where you don't have any conversation going on with them. You have very little to no interaction. But deaf children who get things are very socially interactive. Inside and outside of the classroom. They always are involved in group assignments, study dates. It's a very different academic situation between those two. That's very different. grew up with that, so I never understood it. When I went to Gallaudet, all my teachers signed just like they always had throughout my entire career. And when I see some of my friends who live with hearing families, and I just see it. It's so different. Parents at dinner, they'll be sitting and the parent might try to sign, but once they get involved in the conversation, they just forget to sign and just all speaking. And my deaf friends would be so used to that, didn't seem to bother them. They were just okay left out. And that hit me hard. I didn't know that was my first time having an experience like that. I never grew up like that. I learned a lot from that. And I do believe that there are parents that do try to sign, but it is just difficult for them. But anyway, when I graduated from that, I was recruited for a lot. I wanted to go to master's school. But Gallaudet didn't offer the program that I wanted. I wanted education administration. Gallaudet did offer that. They did offer a PhD, no masters. So I had to take those classes a year in university. I went to American University and I had to get an interpreter. So of course I was the one deaf person in the entire class. And I had my interpreter, and it found it strikingly difficult to be in that kind of exciting. The class itself wasn't hard. It was very difficult not to be able to study in groups, not to be able to meet with students at class, and study tests. I had always done that my entire life, and share notes when I went to deaf school, and always had active conversation together. But I didn't have the opportunity to have that at American University. When our professor would hand out group projects, students would meet outside class, maybe 3 people would work together, and I wasn't able to do that. And I found that very frustrating. I couldn't have an interpreter present because the interpreter was just for class, scheduled class only. So I would have had to request another interpreter for after school assignments. But in order to do that, I needed to know the time and date. And so I'd ask these other students, what's the time and date? I need to be able to interpret ahead of time. And they just didn't understand that because most of the time you just decide to do it at the snap of the finger when you're in the mood to do it. And even then, if the interpreter is able to be present for that, they're only available for a scheduled time. That might be 1 hour, so it might be 2 hours, but if we run over that, she's got to leave. And it's just very difficult to be able to plan those things when you need to have an interpreter present. It was much of a struggle. And the worst part about the whole thing was that I had to study for comps myself. There were several other students who would take master's comps at Gallaudet, and they might have 6 or 7 or 8 students together in a group. And they'd split the group up, some people would work on these parts of the questions, some people would work on these, but I had to do the whole thing myself. And so when I say, hey, could you guys give me the notes, they'd give me the notes, but there was no discussion to follow that. So I'm copying these answers, but I'm not actually learning anything. It was very difficult to have that out-of-class discussion. So I made it through comps, I passed, but looking back, I just think, wow, can you imagine being 3, 4, or 5 years old as a deaf student going through that? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. So now I have 2 deaf children, and I want the absolute best for them. I decided that there's no way that my deaf children are going to go to a mainstream school. There's no way. There are some negatives to sending them to a deaf school for sure. The deaf schools tend to have math, English classes that are a little bit behind the hearing curriculum. They might not have the opportunity to learn those things at home because they're learning those things from hearing parents that don't have that language acquisition that they need. So when they go to school, they have to learn that. By the time that hearing kids are going to school, they already have the language, they already have the exposure, but deaf students don't always have that. So when they're going into school, those schools are behind trying to teach them that. So it forces all of the other kids to fall behind as well. Deaf schools are slower, so it's my job to encourage deaf schools and deaf institutes to pick up the pace faster for those who already have language acquisition and give them more of a challenge. Many deaf students, think, oh, this is so easy, and they're just playing around. They need to be working hard. They need to be challenged. They need to be stimulated. We need to give them homework and make them study, just like hearing schools do. It needs to be the same, but the deaf schools are behind due to the language barrier. I've seen that several times myself through my own experiences and my friends' kids' experiences. If you have to go to the library to read, I want my kids to do that. The Kindle school doesn't require them to do that, but they might have it when they're young for 1 or 2 years. But I wonder, at the hearing schools, they're reading at 5, so I have to be a little bit patient when sending my kids to the deaf schools, that they're going to be doing things that hearing people are going to do later. But there are lots of benefits about sending children to the deaf school. Their social skills, their confidence, their motivation. What those kids are learning from class, they're learning 1/4 of the information from class. 3/4 of your learning happens outside of class. So I feel it's more worth it to send my children to a deaf school if 3/4 of your learning comes outside of class. If I'm being honest, I chose Kendall School because they are more up to date on their curriculum. Meanwhile, the Maryland School for the Deaf is a very good school, but it's interesting that, at the age of 3 and 4, they are teaching the same things that I learned when I was 5 or 6. Nothing's changed. The curriculum is the same. Nothing's changed. But the Kindle School, they've got computers and updated technology. They have the money to spend on updating their equipment. So, for example, my son took a speech class, and at their speech class, he found it to be very fun. When he was learning how to say the M sound, the long M, they have a computer system that has a horse that runs, and as you pronounce the long M sound, those horses run faster. Meanwhile, at the Maryland School for the Deaf, they don't have that. They're still using a feather to teach children how to manipulate their tongue to make sounds. But the technology is so much more advanced at Kindle. I just think that the Maryland School for the Deaf doesn't have the money to spend on that equipment, and that's fine. But I would just rather have my kids go to the Kindle School where they have the opportunities to have education be more fun for them. Now, what will happen to my kids when they turn 8 or 9 or 10? I hope they stay with the deaf school. But I've also heard that some other parents of deaf children have problems continuing in the deaf school because of their level. Their kids might be too far advanced for the Kindle school to be able to give them what they need. Because the percent of students who are at the same level might be 20-ish%, but those kids who are brighter, they don't have programs to teach those kids who are brighter to be more stimulated. So they end up throwing those kids into a mainstream school. So us parents have always discussed, while our kids are young, we would like to send them to a deaf school, and also encourage a deaf school to set up projects for those gifted kids, and maybe cut other programs, because if they set up a gifted program, who's going to pay those teachers? Who's going to pay for those technologies? Cut the programs that are less important and use that to set up a gifted program. So the number of deaf students is small. It's important to approach that. But overall, I think my wife and I's decision to send our school to the Kindle school was a good decision. It was based on our personal experiences, and I forgot to say, my wife grew up in a hearing school herself. She went to a deaf high school, and all her life, her experiences with hearing schools were awful. They were just very hard for her. She was not happy. So when she went to this deaf school, it changed her life. She wished that she would have gone to deaf school when she was younger. She's doing okay, but we just decided we wanted our kids to have that experience from the get-go. And other parents that I've discussed with who send their kids to mainstream schools have different opinions. And we've discuss those opinions as well. And I just think it's interesting, if possible in the future, to be able to sit down together and have that discussion. Why did you send your kids there? Why did you send your kids there? And get all kinds of different perspectives. It'd be better for teachers in management positions to be able to make those decisions about who goes where and where they send their kids to school.